When Dana decided to become a nurse, she never thought her career choice would lead her to her soulmate. She'd always been a closed-off person, with an awkwardness that never allowed her to make friends. But with him, everything had been easier. He listened attentively to her without interrupting and was always there when she wanted to see him. But of course, this was because he was in a coma. Plumber sees his picture in wealthy house, uncovers terrible secret. Dana Wheatfield met Grant at the trauma unit of her local hospital while finalizing her nursing degree. She'd been on her last days at the hospital when the ambulance brought him in. Even now, she could remember that night. It had rained, and the roads throughout the county were slippery and wet. When the EMTs brought him in, a John Doe seemingly in his late 20s, he'd sustained a massive head injury. Though it's rare for medical practitioners to form attachments to their patients, the possibility is never zero. For Dana, her attraction to the man other nurses named Grant started as a simple crush. She'd returned to the hospital after graduation and was looking to start a professional career. And who else would the hospital direct her to than Grant, who was still in a coma? Dana's routine with Grant was easy enough. She'd come in the morning to check his vitals and shave and clean him. Afterward, she'd ensure he got his fluids and nutrients before counter-checking his daily medicine. The routine soon became numb, and Dana started talking to him to keep things interesting and lively. But in these silent conversations, she'd find something she'd never experienced. Dana found a connection with her quiet patient that she couldn't explain. As the months flew by, she found herself constantly drawn to him, needing to talk or play mellow music in his room as the minutes counted by. No family or friends had come to claim him, which endeared him to Dana even more. But one day, everything would come to an abrupt stop. It had been 2 years since Grant was admitted to the hospital when he woke up. Dana had been playing music in his room, but as she stood to change her playlist, he suddenly asked her to repeat the last song. She did before rushing to call the doctors. After a few preliminary tests, the conclusion was that the man had severe short-term memory loss, which was because of his head injury. But the doctors assured him he'd remember with time. They had no idea what secrets his mind held. As Grant knew nothing about himself and had no next of kin or friend to help, he wholeheartedly accepted Dana's help to acclimate to his new life. She helped him move into a different room and brought him books to read and songs to listen to. But as the weeks went by, the two began getting close. They'd take long walks outside the hospital in the evenings and go to the movies on the weekends. Soon, it was clear that they were meant for each other. Grant moved in with Dana as the 8th month came to a close. He still didn't know who he was but knew he was great with his hands. He'd shown unmatched prowess in anything that needed him to get hands on and suspected it had been a massive part of his previous life. But living with the love of his life proved more difficult than he'd expected. Dana needed help with bills, and Grant would have to get a job soon. This would open a jar of worms bigger than the two could have ever imagined. Through Dana's connections, Grant managed to find work as a plumber's assistant. He loved the premise of fixing bathrooms, and Dana's cousin, who ran a plumbing business, needed help with some projects. With Grant by his side, they took a contract on one of the biggest mansions in their city, looking to expand their company portfolio and get Grant some hands-on experience. They had no idea what awaited them at the house. It was a fine morning when Grant and Dana's cousin showed up at the mansion for work. The house was massive as it was beautiful, but more than that, it struck Grant as familiar. He pushed the thought aside and got to work, but the more time he spent within the mansion, the more he felt like he'd been there. Everything would soon make sense. Grant and Dana's cousin were on lunch break when Grant went to use the bathroom. After a quick word with the mansion's steward, who had given Grant weird looks throughout the day, he hurried upstairs to one of the guest rooms. But he wasn't halfway up the mansion's staircase when his sight landed on a towering painting of himself across the living room. His brows furrowed, and then it happened. Like an avalanche racing down a mountain, memories scoured his mind. He clutched his temples as the pain built up, seeing flashes of who he used to be before his head injury. He saw a life where he'd been a wealthy painter under a pseudonym. His sight darkened with black splotches as the pain became too much to bear. And then he woke up in a hospital bed. Grant woke up with Dana by his side. He was back in his old room in the hospital, with medical equipment beeping by his side. Dana's cousin, a doctor, an officer, and the mansion's steward were also present. Grant's head was still in pain. But he could remember everything that happened to him. He was about to talk when the officer interjected. The officer reported that Grant's family filed a missing persons report after they couldn't find him for a week. They'd searched all over the country, from his penthouses to his favorite hotels, but came up short. His family held a funeral service a year later. But Grant could remember in excruciating detail what happened that fateful night and couldn't wait to share his story. Grant explained that his car had veered off a sleek mountainside into a massive river. He'd decided to jump out at the last minute. Dana revealed that the night the EMTs brought him in, they reported that a passerby found him bleeding in the thicket several feet from the river. Grant's real name was Drake McAllister, and he'd finally got his life back. But he knew everything that happened was for a reason, to lead him to the love of his life, who, despite knowing he had nothing, stayed by his side. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.